Gentlemen, how's it going, everybody? Good to see you today. Welcome to a stream on the War of 1812, starring me, Lord Maulington, with another lovely slideshow presentation for you. The War of 1812, the war in which the United States gets fucked by Canada. Everybody point and laugh at the Americans. They got their ass kicked. Hey, Red Goliath, how's it going, buddy? Hello, I'm alive. I'm still not feeling great, but I'm alive. Yeah, I think before we continue with today's stream, we're going to take a moment here and we're going to sing the US national anthem. We're gonna sing the national anthem of the United States. I want everybody to stand up, even if you're not American. I want you to stand up whilst we all sing the anthem of the greatest country in the world. Shit, where the fuck did I... Oh, Christ. Did I close it down? Did I close my tab? Hang on, I've got 700 million billion tabs. Oh, Christ. Hang on. Oh, no, wait, I got it. Here we go. Yeah. Okay. We're gonna... All right, everybody, are you standing? Are you all standing? I want you to stand. We've got to sing the song, all right? I haven't got the cadence, like the tempo of this song quite down yet, so I might be out of tune. Okay, all right, here we go. We're going to sing the US national anthem. Oh, hang on a minute. Is there sound? Yes. Okay, hang on. Has it got the lyrics? All right, here we go. Stand up. Oh, say can you see? Hang on, let me turn the volume down so you can actually hear me sing. The dawn's early light, what so proudly we held at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight. Oh, the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof to the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave? Oh, the land of the free and the home of the brave. All right, there we go. I won't sing the entire thing. I'll spare you that. Okay, hang on. Let me get my notes up. Hello, everybody, and welcome to a lecture on the War of 1812, presenting by me, of course, Lord Maulington, lisping English retard, and, of course, not a furry. The War of 1812 is an interesting... Bravo, thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. I think every single time I do one of these streams, I'm going to sing, like, a song that's relating to the conflict in some way. But, yeah, so the War of 1812 is an interesting war. It's a war that really is completely insignificant to like the British themselves. This is just one. We had bigger things going on than to care about this colonial war. But I'd say the War of 1812 in some circles is described as like the second War of Independence. I don't think that's entirely accurate, but I'd say the War of 1812 for the United States is probably a war that's just as influential in its national identity as the Revolutionary War of 1776. So we're going to go into some of the reasons as to why that is. Obviously, as the historians in the channel may know, your national anthem comes from obviously the burning down of the White House and the battles around that. So yeah, let's continue on with the next slide. So in today's agenda, we're going to take a look at the origins of the War of 1812. We're going to take a look at why it started. We're going to take a look at the objectives of each side on the war. And we're going to do an analysis as to why they had the objectives that they did. Hey, Whimsy. How are you doing, Whimsy, sweetheart? How's your hip doing, Whimsy? Are you feeling any better? Yeah, the Whimsy's not been feeling too good either lately, guys. Send her your best wishes. We're going to take a look. We're going to take the look at the state of the world in 1812, because taking a look at obviously the strategic situation of Europe and North America in 1812 is essential to understanding exactly why things are the way they are, particularly how the British see this war and why the United States took the actions that it did. We're going to take a look at the overview of the major battles, campaigns, and events on land and at sea during the War of 1812. I've gone into too much detail, honestly. I don't think I'm going to be able to complete this all in one stream, which is what I wanted to do. So I think today we're going to cover up until the first major battle between the United States and the United Kingdom, and then in the second stream we're going to really get into the detail of the actual conflicts that took place. It's worse. Oh God, I'm sorry to hear that, Whimsy. I hope you get well soon. Oh God, yeah, I've got that to look forward to. We're getting old, guys. We're all getting old here. We're getting problems. I'm starting to get problems. We're going to take a look at the British and the US order of battle in the war as well. It's quite interesting. It obviously fluctuates over the 3 years of the war as people die and things escalate. And then what we're going to do is we're going to do an analysis of the outcome. We're going to take a look at how far each side achieved its aims and how it influenced the foreign policy of both sides. So to kind of, I'm not that old. We're old enough. We're old enough. The average VTuber fan is like 20 years old these days. But I'm of the opinion that the War of 1812 was a minor US defeat. There are people who have the opinion that it was a draw. There are people who have the opinion that it was a major US defeat, and there are people who don't care. I think the war was a minor US defeat. I'll go into the reasons why. I mean, we laugh at the Americans, quote unquote, losing, but I think the United States got an awful lot out of the War of 1812, even though it didn't exactly achieve all of its major goals, and that it has basically influenced US foreign policy to this day, particularly. We start to see in the War of 1812, we start to see early US manifest destiny. So the origins of the War of 1812. It's called the War of 1812. In reality, it lasted exactly, roughly 32 months, following the US declaration of war on Britain in June of 1812, which, by the way, that's longer than the Mexican-American War, Spanish-American War, and the US involvement in World War I. So for roughly a century, the conflict didn't merit so much as a capital W in its name, and it was often called the War lowercase of 1812. That's how much American historians cared about it at first. The British were even more dismissive. They termed it the American War of 1812 to distinguish the conflict from the much greater Napoleonic Wars which were in progress at the time. We were defeated by budget cuts. Well, you declared the war prematurely. You weren't ready. You weren't good to go. Hey, Gendrick. Any hamster facts for us today, Gendrick? So the US declares war against Britain. One of the leading reasons was the impressment of American seamen into the Royal Navy, which wasn't an uncommon act among navies at the time, but one that would obviously incense Americans nonetheless, because obviously we are essentially we are kidnapping American citizens to serve in our military, to serve in our navy. And this is kind of what the period was like in the days. It was still a day where foreign powers would steal people from other militaries if they caught them deserting or if they were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. There were many, for example, British guys and German deserters who were, for example, like conscripted into each other's military. So you get like German deserters were basically forced into the British army. And the way they were able to get German soldiers to do this was because the provosts, which were like the early form of military police, would capture deserters from other powers, and they would say, right, lads, you're serving in the British Army now, and if you don't want to serve in the British Army, we're going to return you back to your own forces where you'll be executed for desertion. So your choice is join the British Army, even though you're German, or we'll send you back home and you'll be killed as a deserter. Wasn't obviously quite the same thing here with impressment in the Americas. So basically the reason why the British did this was because there was a law in Great Britain at the time where it was legal for Britain to essentially impress people, which was the act of forcibly introducing people as sailors into the Royal Navy if they weren't citizens of the United Kingdom. So from the political perspective of the British in this era, they technically in some respects didn't actually recognize US citizens as being US citizens. They were still considered British, but obviously rebel British people who aren't in compliance. So from many in the British establishment, it was seen perfectly okay to conscript, to impress Americans into the Royal Navy service, because they weren't Americans anyway. They were basically treasonous British people. Yeah, we love our seamen. Giggity, giggity. Yeah, so anyway, so at the time, the President of the United States, James Madison, the State Department reported that roughly 6,257 Americans were pressed into service from 1807 through to 1812. The other reason for why the war eventually started was that the British were also funding, arming, and otherwise supporting Native Americans' resistance against US expansion into their lands. So this is obviously before the time where the Native American population of the United States were all put into reservations and pacified. This is still very early into the US expansionary days, and obviously from the Native American perspective, who are in, I guess, what you'd now consider to be US territories, they would have the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So they would naturally see the British as likely allies and partners to help resist US westward expansion. So what also the British wanted to restrict US trade with Europe through naval blockades and privateering. So in this period of time, the act of performing naval blockades and privateering, which is where you basically attack the merchant shipping of another nation with your ships, isn't actually an act of war, but it will probably lead to one if the nation state can afford to go into conflict with you. I think any nation state worth its salt isn't exactly going to take kindly to another country stealing its merchant shipping and obviously stealing its sailors and forcing it to serve in a foreign nation. If the British offered American sailors a loan to buy a Camaro, they'd go willingly. Yeah, about, what is it, 50% APR? Is it a Camaro? I thought it was a Dodge Challenger that new American GIs loved. I thought it was the Challenger was the private soldier's vehicle of choice. So when we take a look at why the United States declared war on the United Kingdom, I think it's obvious that the US it's very clearly motivated by a desire to fucking yeet as much territory it can, whilst all the big European powers are busy killing each other in the Napoleonic War, and are obviously limited in their ability to further colonize the continent and resist US aggression. It's in the best interest of the United States at this time to expand as quickly as possible for its national security and survival. And also, something I don't actually see in the discourse that much from either US or British historians is that the United States is obviously motivated by desire to get the British to fuck off and leave them alone, because the British are constantly meddling in American domestic and international affairs in this period, as we'll get into in more detail. Okay, hang on. Before we go into the objectives of each side, let's go into a bit more detail then about the situation. Hey, Ross, how's it going, buddy? Good to see you. Hang on. Actually, let's put some background music on as well, just so you don't have my waffling on in the in the thing. Let's see. Let's get some music on. Is there any particular genre of music you'd like to whilst I waffle on about the War of 1812? What's a good mix? What's a good copyright-free mix? Something drum and bassy, maybe, I don't know. What about trap? Trap Nation. I don't know, do you want music in the background, or are you okay to just hear my voice for a while? The Battle of New Orleans? Okay, hang on a sec. New Orleans. Maybe we would... Maybe we'll just sing it like patriotic American war songs or something. Hang on, I know. Battle Hymn of the Republic. Yeah, sing this one. Since I've got a big American audience, let's just play American songs to keep you guys happy. Alright, here we go. Colonial music. Okay, so on the upset of the 19th century, Great Britain was locked in a long and bitter conflict with. Let me turn that down a little bit more. Was locked in a long and bitter conflict with Napoleon Bonaparte's France. In an attempt to cut off supplies from reaching the enemy, both sides attempted to block the United States from trading with the other. So in 1807, Britain passed the Orders in Council, which required neutral countries to obtain a license. A license? You boys got a license to be existing? I don't see a license. Obtain a license from its authorities before trading with France or French colonies. The Royal Navy also outraged Americans by its practice of impressment or removing seamen from US merchant vessels and forcing them to serve on behalf of the British. So the President of the United States at the time, when this first started happening, was Thomas Jefferson, bearing in mind the impressment started in 1807. So Thomas Jefferson would leave office in 1809. So the actual President of the United States, when hostilities started, was James Madison. Load the music a bit. Okay. There we go. How's that? So it's important to remember that during this time, despite the War of 1776, relations had actually become relatively okay between the Jefferson government of 1801, and US shipping prospered through trade with the Franco-Spanish empires, and the Jay Treaty, which was signed in November of 1794, which meant that American maritime commerce was given trading privileges in England and the British East Indies. In return for this, Britain agreed to evacuate forts still held in the Northwestern Territories, and the Mississippi River was declared freely open to both countries. So after 1776, there was an attempt between most American leaders and the British establishment to form a kind of, not an alliance as such, but to mend the hostilities of the war and form a kind of live and let live policy where we'd leave the Americans the fuck alone and the Americans would leave us the fuck alone. But eventually what would start to happen is that this policy of, I guess, kind of peace with England or the British Empire was becoming deeply unpopular among certain people in the United States, particularly among the Republicans, who favoured US alignment with the French instead of the British, which is a crazy thing to think about, right? So this group of Republicans were led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. They used the outrage of the treaty to try and wrestle power away from the pro-British Federalist group led by George Washington and John Adams. As we all know, John Adams. I watched that TV show about John Adams with fucking what's-his-face, that Italian guy who was in Band of Brothers. What's his name? I forget his name now. That was pretty good. So as Jefferson was pro-French, you can imagine once he became president in 1801, relations quickly deteriorated between Great Britain and the United States. There's some debate over the scale of impressment. There are some historians who say it was over 6,000. That was certainly the outrageous number provided by the US Republicans at the time. However, Massachusetts Senator James Lloyd, who, bearing in mind, is a Federalist, who are the pro-British faction, and he was a political rival of James Madison, argued that actually the war hawks, the Republicans, were essentially exaggerating the amount of American sailors being pressed into British service in order to justify a war to Congress, basically. Doesn't that sound familiar? It's 2024 and we're still making up shit to to try and force wars through Congress. The war wasn't particularly popular, despite it being probably quite popular and patriotic now. So there were other leaders in the area of New England, particularly those with ties to the shipping industry, doubted the severity of the problem. There was Mr. Timothy Pickering, the Bay State's other senator, who commissioned a study that counted the total number of impressed seamen from Massachusetts was roughly about 100 people, and the total number of Americans forcibly impressed into Royal Navy service was just a couple of hundred. I think both sides, their numbers are a bit dubious, because naturally the side who's actively trying to go to war is going to grossly exaggerate the numbers in order to rile up the American people and get support for their aim to go to war. And the New Englanders don't want a conflict with Great Britain, so they're going to try to obviously downplay the extent of the problem in order to obviously avoid a war. To be fair, the French was our crutch during the Revolution. It was. Obviously, the United States probably wouldn't have been able to win the Revolutionary War without the support of Spain and France, but it's important to remember as well that the United States' spirit, the spirit to resist and fight, is essential as well. If the Americans didn't have the spirit to fight in this war and the War of 1776, then you would still be I don't know if you'd still be a British colony. You'd probably... Yeah, I think if you didn't have a revolution in 1776, you would have probably had a revolution in the mid 19th century, late 19th century anyway. I think the Revolutionary War and the breakaway from England was always going to happen for Americans. It's just a matter of when. Okay. So, Britain's support for the Native Americans in conflicts with the United States, as well as our own designs on the North American frontier, it pushed Southern and Western senators in the US towards war. But the problem is they needed more support to declare it. An issue that could paint the US as a victim of British aggression would obviously help them achieve the same. And of the 19 senators who passed the declaration of war, only 3 were from New England, and none of them were Federalists, who are again the pro-British faction. So, in 1809, the US Congress repealed Thomas Jefferson's unpopular Embargo Act, which, by restricting trade, had probably hurt Americans more than either Britain or France. So its replacement was called the Non-Intercourse Act, giggity, which specifically prohibited trade with Britain and France, which was also unfortunately ineffective, and in turn was replaced in May of 1810 with a bill that stated that if either Britain or France dropped its trade restrictions against the United States, then Congress would in turn resume non-intercourse with the opposing power. So basically, if Britain dropped its embargo with the United States would stop trading with France and would trade with Britain, and vice versa. So later on you'll see that ultimately the French did decide to stop embargoing the United States, and so the United States took a more and more pro-French policy. So after Napoleon hinted he would stop restrictions, President James Madison blocked all trade with Britain that November. And meanwhile, new members of Congress were elected that year by a Mr. Henry Clay. I take it you know who Henry Clay is, obviously, Merrick. So Henry Clay was an American lawyer and statesman who represented the state of Kentucky in both the US Senate and House of Representatives. He would go on to be the 7th House Speaker of the United States, as well as the 9th Secretary of State. He unsuccessfully ran for president in 1824, 1832 and 1844 elections. He tried to become president for a very long time. Unfortunately, he was a terminal loser. Get fucked, idiot. So together with Congressman John C. Calhoun, they had begun to agitate for war against the English. Of course, based on that indignation over British violations of maritime rights, as well as Britain's encouragement of Native American hostility against the United States' westward expansion. Fun fact, by the way, the War of 1812 produced a new generation of great American generals, including Andrew Jackson, Jacob Brown, and Winfield Scott, and it helped propel no fewer than 4 men to the presidency. So of the officers who served in the War of 1812, we have Jackson, John Quincy Adams, James Monroe, and William Henry Harrison. So let's take a look at the objectives of each side. I'm just gonna walk right into Canada, said some guy who lost Maine and Michigan and Detroit. So, the US objectives. Get the fuck off my lawn, England. So the US objectives of the war were, number 1, fuck off England. Stop stealing our sailors. Let us trade with Europe and sell ships for war and commerce. A little known fact about the United States at the time, they were actually really pretty fucking good shipbuilders. The United States built some damn good, were particularly adept at building frigates, as we'll later see in some of the naval engagements. The frigates produced by the United States were, in many respects, actually superior to many of the greatest and oldest European shipbuilders. Good old Ironsides, exactly. The USS Constitution. Obviously, they wanted Britain to stop giving money and weapons and support to the Native Americans who were violently murdering and massacring US colonists on the westward expansion. The other part of the US objectives was early Manifest Destiny. Before it went popular and mainstream, sort of Manifest Destiny kind of began in about 1810, 1811. It didn't really become a particularly big thing until 1850, but we start to see its early kind of roots here in the War of 1812. Obviously, what the United States wants as part of early Manifest Destiny is it wants England to get the fuck off the continent in its entirety. Obviously, not just England, it wants France and Spain. It wants all the big European powers to fuck off and leave them alone. Get off the continent as the continent of North America belongs to the United States as ordained by God himself. God has determined that North America is American. So the acquisition of Canada this year, as far as the neighbourhood of Quebec, will be a mere matter of marching and will give us experience for the attack of Halifax, the next and final expulsion of England from the American continent. The exact word used by some American politicians? A letter written to William Duane on August 4th, 1812. We're just going to walk right into Canada, guys. In and out, 20-minute adventure. We're going to walk into Canada and, yeah, we're going to double our size. Nothing will go... What could go wrong? What could go wrong? Nothing will go wrong, right? There's nothing in Canada. And obviously the final objective of the US war, the final objective of the War of 1812 is the United States wanted to show the world that it's not a pushover. It wants to show the world that it will respect its power, its influence and its sovereignty. Sort of a display to show that the United States isn't a literal who and it can and will defend its right to exist and that you can't just do whatever you want in its territories. This is particularly apparent after, obviously, the Chesapeake. It's really hard to say this word. There was the Chesapeake Leopard affair, where a British fourth rate, which is a naval vessel, was looking for Royal Navy deserters in American territorial waters, and it captured a US frigate in an unprovoked attack, which really fucking pissed off the Americans, right? As it would. The world will respect my fart, huh? Exactly. Cheesecake. It's Chesapeake. Chesapeake? Chesapeake. Is it Chesapeake? I thought it was like Chesapeake or something. Chesapeake. Chesapeake. Yeah, okay, so if we go over the British objectives, I like how some Americans don't say British, they say British. They say British, it's the British. My father and all his men were killed in 1812, Anno Domini, by the British and all his men. So the first and most important objective of the British was to defend Canada. Oh fuck, a bit busy with Boney at the moment, lads. If you could fuck off for 3 years until we're done with old Boney, that would be good, thank you. So, yeah. England is currently in a war for survival with France during this period of time. British Empire wants to cut off US trade to its enemy France, even though the United States is a neutral power and it's perfectly legitimate for the United States to trade with whoever the fuck it wants in Europe. It's obviously against British interests to allow that to happen, so yeah, Britain wants to stop American trade from getting through. The United Kingdom wanted to create a Native American barrier state between US and Canada to stop future potential border skirmishes. So the idea of a barrier state for Native Americans would kind of be between kind of like the Michigan kind of Northwestern Territory area. It would hope that that would prevent a massive conflict between obviously the Canadian area and the United States proper. This was obviously absolutely unacceptable terms to the United States, and this idea of a barrier state would, after this war in particular, all those hopes from the British would cease at that point. They've been trying for 30 years. They learned their lesson after 1812. It wasn't going to happen. So the exact literature of the time stated, if possible, England wished to avoid war with America, but not to the extent of allowing her to hinder the British war effort against France. Moreover, a large section of influential British opinion, both in government and in the country at the time, thought that America presented a threat to British maritime supremacy. So, yes, at the time, after the Battle of Trafalgar, Britain essentially became the greatest maritime power in the world. Previously, it was thought of to be France. And with the United States and its fantastic frigate shipbuilding, basically Britain didn't want the United States to potentially rebuild the French Navy and threaten its hegemony over not just European territorial waters, but North American territorial waters as well. We'll look at the orbit of both forces later, but during this period of time, Britain had 515 ships globally, whereas the United States had a fleet of, I believe, around 26. So the United States was outnumbered in terms of shipping 20 to 1, which aren't exactly good numbers. Ooh. So before we get into the state of the world in 1812, I want to explain why I think that there's this myth, there's this, how do you describe it? There's this attitude amongst some American historians in particular, where they believe that the idea that the United States wanted to annex Canada as part of its major war goals is a myth, and I don't believe that it's a myth, and I'll explain my point of view as to why. Many of the historians who kind of argue this point of view tend to be the kind of American historians who want to spin everything into some kind of victory against the US, or give the US like kind of disproportionate credit in historical events of which is involved. So these tend to be the kind of historians, right, where it's like where the Falklands War, for example, was an American victory because the Americans gave Sidewinder missiles to Britain, therefore it's an American victory. We're talking about these kinds of people, right? Okay. So the reason why I don't think it's a myth that the United States did in fact want to annex Canada is because if you take a look at the influence of the war hawks, the Republicans, and how the US Army conducted itself in Canadian territorial areas, relative to how the British Army conducted itself when occupying US territory, there's key differences between the British, who were clearly motivated by a disengagement, and the Americans who allegedly weren't motivated by territorial goals. But before we get into that, it's important to remember that this war, the War of 1812, at the time was actually quite unpopular with many Americans, particularly with those who lived in New England. And it's important to remember that Canada was not a self-governing state in 1812. Canada was a British colony at the time. There was no Canada in 1812, really. So Toronto, for example, was called York at the time. However, to differentiate the local colonist forces and the motherland, I'm going to be using terms like Canadian and British to separate the two. So I don't think that the War of 1812 definitely wasn't a policing action, as some people like to frame it. It was very much a kind of brutal all-out war. About 480,000 US citizens were mobilized as militia just in case to defend the continental United States. So a mobilization of a militia of nearly 500,000 is a bit more than a policing action, right? But American, Western and Southern war hawks, such as Congressman and Senator Henry Cole, pushed for war in the hope of making US territorial gains in Canada and in Florida, whilst the British were tied up with Napoleon. So Clay reasoned that the conquest of Canada would remove a long-standing threat to America's national security, on the North American continent and restore the national honour to the USA. So in 1811, John Quincy Adams wrote to his father stating that the whole continent of North America appears to be destined by divine providence to be peopled by one nation, speaking one language, professing one general system of religious and political principles, and accustomed to one general tenor of social usage and customs for the common happiness of them all. For their peace and prosperity, I believe it is indispensable that they should be associated in one federal union. So essentially what he's saying there is he believes that it is ordained by God for the entirety of the North and South American continents to be one federal union. Everything is America in America. There is no North America, there is no South America, there is only the United States of America. Hell yeah, if only. So if you take a look at the United States history, I mean, if you take an honest look at the US history and its history of expansionism, the United States itself, I think, rarely ever respects the sovereignty or laws of other states, particularly during its colonial periods, unless it's made to by force. The United States, both now during the period of 1812 and for the next 100 years, essentially grabs and keeps everything it can get away with and won't budge unless it's forced to militarily. So my rationale for this statement is that you can see this with the US settlers illegally moving into Canadian territories to steal gold from British Canadian lands, obviously during the big gold rush, and using the force of arms and murdering British police officers who tried to remove the American settlers who were illegally entering their territories to steal their gold. This happened quite a bit in the 19th century, and this nearly escalated into war numerous times. You can also see it in US violations of its own agreements with Native Americans in the 19th century, and general border skirmishes and disputes, such as the indirect approval of the Fenian raids into British Canadian territories in the 1860s, which was a major factor into the federalisation of Canada in the first place. So whilst I believe Canadian annexation was a major goal, there's nothing that the Americans have done in its history, I think, that would suggest it would willingly give up any land it occupied for free. That's my opinion. I don't know how Americans would think about that. I think most Americans would say that's just base as fuck, that you should, and I would agree. Why wouldn't you want to annex and grab as much shit as you can if you don't have to give it up afterwards? If there's one thing that annoys me about, I guess, contemporary modern history, is that most people judge the actions of the past by modern sensibilities of morality. Which is admirable but mistaken. The United States has benefited massively from yoinking shit and then going, if you want it back, make me. Right? Because every time the United States does that, its enemies was always in a position to go, oh fuck, we really can't afford a war right now. So it's like, yeah, ours, mine. Anyway. So let's take a look at some of the reasons as to why people believe this annexation of Canada is a myth. So most of the inhabitants of Upper Canada at this time, which is now known as Ontario, by the way, so basically the Canadian province of Ontario, most of the inhabitants were Americans, but some of them were exiled United Empire loyalists. So these were people these were Americans who fought for the British during the Revolutionary War. And a lot of the residents of Ontario were recent immigrants. So the loyalists were extremely hostile to American annexation, and the US government knew this. And the other settlers seem to have been uninterested and to have remained neutral during the war. So essentially, the people who actually lived in Canada, even the people who immigrated from the United States proper, they were either anti-US government or they just didn't give a shit either way. So they weren't particularly pleased at the idea. They didn't fancy an approaching American army as liberators, which is a point of view some people in Congress argued. So the Canadian colonies were very thinly populated at the time and only lightly defended by the British Army. And some Americans believed that many in Upper Canada would rise up and greet the American invading army as liberators. So the combination implied an easy conquest. And once the war began, now ex-US President Thomas Jefferson warned that the British presence posed a grave threat and pointed to the infamous intrigues of Great Britain to destroy our government, and with the Indians to tomahawk our women and children, and prove that the... I'm not going to do my American accent, I'll make you cringe. I don't know. I'm going to do my American accent as I read this. I don't know what accent this is, but it's vaguely American. To prove that the cession of Canada, the fulcrum for these Machiavellian labors, must be a sine qua non at treaty of peace, he predicted that in late 1812 that the acquisition of Canada this year, as far as the neighborhood of Quebec, will be a mere matter of marching, and will give us the experience for the attack on Halifax, the next and final expulsion of England from the American continent. 1930 radio voice, yeah. Okay, folks, we got the horse races here today. The English are coming in. So anyway, a historian by the name of Mass argued in 2015 that the expansionist theme is a myth that goes against the relative consensus among experts that the primary US objective was the repeal of British maritime restrictions. He argued that the consensus among scholars to be that the US went to war because 6 years of economic sanctions by the British had failed to, 6 years of economic sanctions had failed to bring Britain to the negotiating table, and threatening the Royal Navy's Canadian supply base was their last hope. However, he also noted that many historians still published expansionism as a cause, and that even those against the idea still included caveats regarding possible expansionism underlying US motives. Mass also agreed that, theoretically speaking, expansionism might have tempted Americans, but he found that leaders of the United States at the time did fear the domestic political consequences of an invasion of Canada, notably what limited expansionism there was focused on sparsely populated western lands rather than the more populous eastern settlements of Canada. So at this time, the area of Toronto, the west section of Canada, wasn't very wealthy to begin with yet, and because it was so sparsely populated, there wasn't really that much infrastructure. So even if the United States did take it and annex it, the cost in terms of treasury and lives probably wouldn't have been worth all that much, at least in the short term. Canada's Thames accent. Okay, anyway, let's move on to the next. So let's take a look at the state of the world in 1812. Oh yeah, I was gonna do another little thing actually to build the atmosphere for this. Hang on. Right, so what is the state of the world in 1812? What's the state of the world in 1812? So during this period of time, the state of the world was this. Well said, Dragon Lord, you're right.
My enemies are many. My equals are none. In the shade of olive trees, they said Italy could never be conquered. In the land of pharaohs and kings, they said Egypt could never be humbled. In the realm of forest and snow, they said Russia could never be tamed. Now they say nothing. They fear me, like a force of nature, a dealer in thunder and death. I say, I am Napoleon. I am Emperor. Burn it!
So basically, during this period of time, Napoleon is the master of Europe. Actually, hang on. I'm gonna get sidetracked quickly and take a look at a meme. Hang on. Let's see if I can find it quickly. Hang on, is it gonna be easy to find? If it's not, I'm just gonna move on. No, never mind. I can't find it. There's a hilarious meme of people mocking like the Napoleon movie for getting its facts wrong about what nations Napoleon didn't conquer. Anyway, let's get back to. Let's put the music back on. Where did I put the music? Oh god, did I delete? I fucking closed the tab. Whoops, my bad. Let's play another US song. Actually, let's just play the fucking US national anthem over and over again. Here we go. There we go. Okay, let's get back on track. So, the War of 1812. So, during this period of time, there was an event called the Peninsular War, which took place between 1807 and 1814. It's the height of the Napoleonic Wars in 1812. France has defeated or brought every major power in Europe into its sphere of influence, except Britain, who it's actively at war with, and Russia, who it's now at peace with after the French defeat and withdrawal. Now that's soldiering. So what the Peninsular War is about is Napoleon made his brother King of Spain against the wishes of the Spanish people and occupies its former ally. So now Spain is now a French puppet, and it implements what's called the continental system. So what the continental system is, all European states are told that trade with the British Empire is banned under penalty of invasion and death. So, yeah, as much as people like to suck the dick of the Prussians, the French invaded Prussia and Napoleon smashed them. Even the Prussians were tamed. There is no one except Britain and Russia who is currently able to stand against the French. And obviously there's neutral Portugal, which we'll get into in just a second. So, of all the European powers, only Portugal refuses the continental system, citing the Anglo-Portuguese alliance of 1373, which will later be renewed in 1386 under a slightly different name. It was originally called the English-Portuguese Treaty. It was then called the Anglo-Portuguese Alliance in 1386. It's just semantics, really. So basically, because Portugal refuses to break its alliance with England and refuses to stop trading with the British, Napoleon invades Portugal through Spain, and Napoleon doesn't expect the British Empire to come to its defense, because for the last, 4 coalitions against France, Britain has mostly been content to just remain in its home islands and pay all the other European powers to go to war with France and die on its behalf. Britain normally only gets involved when it comes to attacking France and its territorial, colonial holdings. So, to Napoleon's shock, Britain does come to Portugal's defence, and the British army deploys on the beaches of Portugal to defeat Napoleon's marshals, encouraging the Spanish to declare a war of independence to remove the French invaders. So essentially, the point is that the Peninsular War, the war in Europe, is a war for Europe's very future. Britain has to commit everything it has towards defeating France. If the British Empire is forced off the continent, then it may usher in an era of French hegemony, which might go on for forever, indefinitely. If Britain can't defeat France, probably no one can at this point. So when the United States obviously declares war on Britain in 1812, it's a bit of a, will you Americans fuck off? Not now, we're busy kind of affair. So what you'll see is that the United Kingdom tries to perform a mostly defensive war. So let's take a look at the makeup of US and British forces during this conflict. If you can dodge a wrench, you can dodge a cannonball. I made that little dodgeball reference there because both sides were completely unprepared for the war that was about to happen, and they basically had to hurriedly conscript and deploy poorly trained and unequipped men to the region, which had disastrous consequences, as we're about to find out. So, God, this is a terrible rendition of the US national anthem. Hang on, let's get something a bit more. Let's get something with a bit more bass to it. Here we go. Yeah, that's a little bit better. I like this one more. Okay. So the United States all brought a battle in 1812. At the beginning of the war, the United States was mostly led by ineffective veterans from the Revolutionary War. And as you can imagine, 1776, it's now 1812. A lot of American officers are getting on a bit now. They're a bit old, and many of them are political appointees, you know, as is the case in Britain as well. But it's the usual thing. They're older men who just want to be the local governor or politician or congressman representing their state, and they just want to drink wine, get fat, and sell their slaves is all they want, right? They don't actually want to go to war and do shit. So despite initial American setbacks, US forces eventually had very capable generals, such as Andrew Jackson, who's in the bottom left, and Mr. Winfield Scott, who's in the bottom right. Fun fact, Winfield Scott here was captured in 1812, released on an officer exchange in 1813, which the British will later come to regret massively. And Jacob Brown in the top left, who kind of looks like, I don't know what kind of pose Mr. Jacob Brown in the top left there is doing. He looks like he's captain of the band camp or something. He looks like a fucking nerd. Look at him. Look at his face. He's like, he's a fucking dweeb. I think you'd give Jacob Brown a swirly if you saw him. And then you've got the Giga Chad here at the bottom right, Mr. Winfield Scott. Look, he looks pissed off and hungry, right? He's your chain smoking alcoholic uncle who just wants to make racial slurs about Mexicans, you know, during the Christmas dinner, and he just wants to watch the TV, right? So prior to 1812, the regular US Army was 10,000 strong on paper. So what we mean by on paper is there were technically 10,000 men in the regular army, but about 5,000 to 3,000 of them were currently undergoing training. So they weren't actually they weren't essentially regulars yet. In reality, the US Army during this period is about 5,000 to 7,000 soldiers, but by the end of the war, there are approximately 36,000 regulars in the United States Army, which is crazy when you think about it, right? You think about how big American armies have been since the Civil War. I think that at one point, the US Army was only about 5,000 men. It's crazy, isn't it? I think, what was it, when Taft, well, I think it was Taft, wasn't it? When Taft went to go meet the president of Mexico in the early 20th century, he brought like his presidential guard alone was about 4,000 men. So the makeup of the 36,000 men, of those, there are about 3,050 Rangers. Obviously, Rogers Rangers were originally formed by the British Army. They essentially fought on the US side during the Revolutionary War. And obviously the job of the Rangers, they were expert light infantrymen and raiders who knew the forests and sort of the wilderness around the British-Canadian border extremely well. Obviously succeeded today by the United States Army's Ranger Regiment. So those guys, elite light infantrymen. There were 458,000 militia. So don't get alarmed by that number. That was how many militia were raised by the United States at the time. But the 458,000 number, these were local defense nationwide. So many of these militiamen would be like as far south as, I don't know, what's like a mid-sized state. I don't know, I'm not really good with my eastern seaboard states. You know what I mean. This wasn't 458,000 men deployed on the Canadian border. It was deployed across all the provinces of the United States, all the states of the United States at the time, right? So the United States, in its time, had 12 frigates. It had 14 various ship types. This can be anything from merchant vessels to support vessels and other ships of the line. And it had 515 privateers. Most of these privateers were American, but the United States did also employ Frenchmen to privateer on its behalf against the British as well. Maybe Georgia, Felix. Yeah, I can't remember if Georgia was a US state at the time. Take care, Merrick. Have a good evening, buddy. Good to see you. But despite the small number of frigates, what you have to remember about these US frigates is that they were brand new frigates using the latest and greatest in naval technology and armor rounding. So obviously, armor becomes much more effective when you essentially slope it. So what the United States did is they developed a class of heavy frigates called the Constitution class for heavy frigates. And what made the Constitution class frigates such incredibly dangerous platforms is that they were faster than anything that could kill them, but they were heavily armored and heavily armed enough that they could absolutely obliterate anything that couldn't outrun them. And they could even give higher classes of ships, so like ships of the line, fourth rates, even the odd third rate, depending on how old it was, could do some very serious damage to those as well. So you could consider it almost, if you're more familiar with modern kind of naval warfare, you could consider the Constitution class ships to be kind of an early form of fast battleship, maybe battlecruiser. It was made out of better wood as well. It's made out of heart of oak, which was the strongest kind of wood that was available at the time. White oak and heart of oak, that's right. But it wasn't just the quality of wood, it was the way that it was the very frame of the frigates themselves was state of the art. It had like the most scientifically at the time perfect sloping. And then if we take a look at the British Orbat, you had the British were led by a Mr. Sir George Prevost, who was the British Army Governor General of the Canadas. So obviously, as I said, Canada wasn't a state at the time. It was run by a Governor General who was British. And the other leaders of the British forces at the time was Shawnee Tribe warrior chief Tecumseh, who formed an anti-US Native Confederacy and unified pro-British Native Americans against US forces. You can see here in the bottom left with a groovy hat with a big feather. And of course, as the Canadians in the chat will know, you also had Major General Sir Isaac Brock, who was responsible for defending Upper Canada from numerous American invasions into the region. So I shouldn't call him Mr. Sir Brock here was the man who readied the British Army and Canadian militia. He predicted that the War of 1812 would become an all-out war. He BTFO'd the US numerous times when it tried to conquer Toronto. And he also was the man who won the battles at Fort Mackinac. And he took Detroit as well. To be honest, the city of Detroit is still in flames, probably from the War of 1812. Detroit always is and always has been a complete dump that no one wants to fight over anyway. I don't think anyone, no one, not even back in 1812, no one wanted to die for Detroit. The British can keep it. Which is funny enough, by the way. The Americans never did actually take Detroit back. The British gave Detroit back as part of the peace agreement. The United States never bothered to even die to try to take it back. It wasn't worth it. But unfortunately, good old Sir Brock was killed in action at the Battle of Queenston Heights, which was the first major serious battle between US and British forces of the period. And this would later have disastrous consequences for the British Army of the period, because Major General Brock was probably the best field commander that the British Army had at the time. And the war kind of started going downhill once he was killed. He wasn't the only good general, but he was definitely the most competent one. So prior to 1812, there were approximately 6,000 British soldiers in the region. So of this, 3,743 were British Army regulars, and the rest were hastily mobilised Canadian, quote-unquote, conscripts, obviously British colonists. And there were 48,000 men by war's end. The militia was only 4,000 strong. Britain had 11 ships of the line, mostly fourth rates, so that's one tier above a heavy frigate. The thing about ships of the line is that they're really good for pitched naval battles. They're absolutely terrible at interdicting, stopping piracy, and they're far too slow to stop the Constitution class US frigates, which you'll see with Old Ironsides. Britain also had 34 frigates. So the 34 frigates that the British Empire had at its disposal in the period were, a lot of them were captured French and Spanish frigates, and they were very old modernized frigates as well. So many of the frigates Britain had at its disposal at the time were built in like before the Revolutionary War even. So they were too slow, too weak, and too poorly armoured to essentially do anything against the Constitution. The few frigates that could actually get into gun range of the Constitution literally couldn't do any damage to the Constitution. Their cannon shells would just bounce off the Constitution because they were too small. And then, which is where obviously the term Old Ironsides comes from. They had 52 various ships of various kinds. So these are like repair ships, merchant vessels. And in addition as well, the British had 10 to 15,000 Native American allies who were very keen to get the Americans to step the fuck off their territories. 1950s Detroit, RIP, OCP Detroit. Yes, send him to Detroit. No, no, please, anything but Detroit. No. So, we've gone over the orbat of the United States and the British. So let's talk about the United States declaring war as it happened. So, when war was declared, neither the British in Canada nor the United States were prepared for war. The Americans were, for some reason, inordinately optimistic in 1812. They were very good to go. William Eustis, the US Secretary of War, stated that we can take the Canadas without soldiers even. We have only to send officers into the province and the people will rally around our standard. And Henry Clay said that the militia of Kentucky are alone competent to place Montreal and Upper Canada at your feet. So, yeah, the all-around attitude among the war hawks was, fuck it, we don't even need an army, we'll just walk right in there and the Canadians will just roll over and die. Unfortunately, that was not what happened at all. So the British government was preoccupied with the European conflict, saw American hostilities as a bothersome distraction rather than a serious issue. And this resulted in a very poor amount of delivery of resources in men, supplies, and naval presence until about 1814. So Napoleon essentially loses in 1814. He makes another go at it in 1815, but there's a 1 year break where Napoleon loses the war. He loses the Peninsular War, and he gets removed from power in France, and he goes into exile, right, into Corsica. And during that period of 1814 until Napoleon's comeback in 1815, where he makes his last-ditch attempt at conquering Europe, there's this 1 year period of freedom where the British are like, right, okay, we've got nothing going on now. All the European powers, we've come together to beat Napoleon. No one wants to stab us in the back. Let's fucking go to America now and stop these goddamn Yankees from trying to annex our Canada. So the number of British troops was approximately, at the time, the number of British troops in the period was essentially the same as the Americans. It was quite even in terms of numbers. So the British War Secretary was Earl Bathurst. So Britain had a very smart Secretary for War, which makes a change. We have a history. We have a very long and rich history of having utterly retarded war secretaries in the UK. But Earl Bathurst recognised the situation that the Canadian colony was in, so he urged Lieutenant General George Prevost to maintain a defensive strategy. Kind of think of the British situation in 1812 to be kind of similar to the one the Confederates were in during the US Civil War. They wanted to force America to the negotiating table rather than actually try to seize the capital and conquer the country. So poor old Prevost was actually quite a competent man, which again makes a change for a British military general governor. He actually had the trust of the Canadians, and he followed the instructions of the war secretary properly, didn't go off and do his own thing, and he concentrated on defending Lower Canada at the expense of Upper Canada, which was more vulnerable to American attacks and allowed few offensive actions. So like a smart general, basically he recognised that Upper Canada was too sparsely populated and too difficult to defend, so rather than concentrating his forces there, where he'll probably inevitably lose, the war of attrition. He's just going to focus on defending what he can defend and not attack the United States unless it is practical. Unfortunately for him, unlike the campaigns across the east coast of Canada and the United States, Prevost was not able to receive the benefit of support from the Royal Navy. So in the early part of the war, the Royal Navy did control the seas of the US-Canadian waters, and obviously naval vessels are basically floating artillery platforms. So even though the British were slightly outnumbered at the beginning of the War of 1812, they did have artillery superiority as long as they were fighting within range of the coast. The United States was also not prepared for war. President Madison had assumed that the state militias would easily seize Canada and that negotiations would soon follow. In 1812, the regular army consisted of fewer of 12,000 men. Congress would later authorize the expansion of the army into about 35,000 men, but the service into the US Army was involuntary at some point, and it became unpopular, and it paid very poorly. There were initially very few trained and experienced officers as well, and most of those who were experienced had either fought in the Revolutionary War at some period ago, or they'd fought in Indian wars, essentially fighting skirmishes. They had no experience fighting protracted land battles, like line battles, with professional European militaries. And many of the militias objected to serving outside their home states. They were undisciplined and performed very poorly against British forces when called upon to fight in unfamiliar territory. Multiple militias refused orders to cross the border and fight on Canadian soil even. So the American prosecution of the war suffered from its unpopularity, especially in New England, where the anti-war speakers were most vocal. Massachusetts Congressman Ebenezer Seaver and William Widgery were publicly insulted and hissed in Boston, while a mob seized Plymouth Chief Justice Charles Turner on the 3rd of August and quote-unquote kicked him through the town. So the people of Boston were so pissed off about the war, they fucking seized the Chief Justice of Boston and literally beat the ever-loving shit out of him publicly on the streets. Oh, if only we did that to people these days, right? We should do that. We should bring that back in style for politicians these days. Anyway, so the United States had some difficulty in financing its war. It disbanded the National Bank, based. I'm in favour of disbanding the Bank of England. And it also, private bankers in the Northeast were opposed to the war. But funnily enough, despite American banks not wanting to fund the war, the United States actually managed to obtain financing for the war from London banks. So basically, English banks were funding the Americans to try to annex English territory. Some things never change. They do that to this day, the Bank of England. And the reason why the British banks did this was to cover overseas bond obligations. So New England failed to provide militia units or financial support, which is a serious blow because New England was one of the most developed parts of the United States at the time. And not only that, but surprisingly, as you may or may not know, New England states actually made very loud and very serious threats to succeed from the United States if they forced them into going into war against England. And this is evidenced by the Hartford Convention. So Britain, being the sneaky fuckers that they are, exploited kind of the internal divisions among the American ranks, and they opted not to blockade the ports of New England for much of the war, and encouraged smuggling in and out of Boston to allow, as long as that smuggling and those resources were trade towards obviously British Empire interests. So this is kind of how the Boston port kind of mafia and like the corruption in the ports of the United States first started in the War of 1812, thanks to the British giving them special treatment. A lot of corrupt drug runners and smugglers made a lot of money with after the War of 1812. So, in the fall of 1811, Indiana's territorial governor, William Henry Harrison, led US troops to victory in the Battle of Tippecanoe. The defeat convinced many Indians in the Northwest Territory, including the celebrated Shawnee Tree Tecumseh, that they needed British support to prevent American settlers from pushing them further out of their lands. So basically, the Native Americans were getting their ass kicked by US Army boys, and they were like, shit, if we help these British fellas, they'll give us our own state on the border, and hopefully that we'll be under their protection and we can continue doing our business. So, Christ, I'm so dehydrated. Every time I take a drink, it's like, God, one elixir. So, by late 1811, the Warhawks, the Republicans in Congress, were starting to put more and more pressure on James Madison. And on June the 18th of 1812, the president signed a declaration of war against Britain. Way! Wasn't William Henry Harrison the president that cursed and died before getting into office? You're right, Dragon. He is. He is. Karma for his, I guess, spotty display in the War of 1812, maybe? I don't know, maybe he was hexed. So, after the declaration of war by James Madison, Congress ultimately voted for war, but both the House and the Senate were bitterly divided on the issue. Most Western and Southern congressmen supported the war, whilst the pro-British Federalists, especially the New Englanders, who heavily relied on trade with Britain, accused war advocates of using the excuse of maritime rights to promote their expansionist agenda, which I don't think is completely fair. If I were president of the United States, I would go to war with England over impressment and like the seizure of my own shipping and sailors from a foreign power. But yeah, I think the answer is it's a bit of both. It was expansionism, it was the naval impressment. So, in order to strike at Great Britain, US forces almost immediately attacked Canada, right? As soon as war was declared, the Americans were like, right, fucking rush B. Just rush B, boys, we're going in, we're gonna go take Canada. It's gonna be great. In and out, 20-minute adventure. So American officials were overly optimistic about the invasion's success, especially given how unprepared US troops were at the time. And on the other side of the border, thanks to good old Sir Isaac Brock, they actually faced a very well managed defence, which was coordinated by Mr. Brock, the British soldier and administrator in charge of Upper Canada, which today is known as Ontario. So, on August 16th, 1812, the United States suffered a humiliating defeat after Sir Brock and Tecumseh's forces chased those led by Michigan's William Hull across the Canadian border, scaring Hull into surrendering Detroit. So Detroit, the city, well, it wasn't really a city at the time, the town of Detroit was surrendered without a single shot being fired. So let's go into the loss of Detroit into some more detail. So the American army at the time who invaded Canada was commanded by William Hull, and they first arrived at a place called Sandwich, which today is known as Windsor, Ontario. As you can see on this map here, I've drawn a little blue arrow which symbolizes where American forces entered Canada, and the red arrow is the deployment of Isaac Brock's forces. So if you're confused as to where the fuck Upper Canada and Lower Canada is, if you don't know where where Toronto is, if you don't know where Windsor is, it's down here basically. You can see a little X down by like sort of between Detroit and Lake Erie. That's where Detroit is. Yeah, that's where Windsor is. So when General Hull first entered Sandwich, he issued a proclamation ordering all British subjects to surrender immediately. The proclamation said that Hull wanted to free them. He wanted to free the Canadians from the tyranny of Great Britain, giving them the liberty, security, and wealth that the United States enjoyed, unless they preferred the war, slavery, and destruction that would be brought about by the English. He also threatened to kill any British soldier caught fighting alongside the Native Americans. Unfortunately for Hull, his proclamation only helped to stiffen resistance to American attacks, particularly as he was seriously lacking in artillery and supplies. So, after invading Canada and the locals telling him to fuck off, Hull immediately withdrew back to the American side of the river on the 7th of August 1812 because he received news of the Native Americans. He received the news of the Shawnee tribe had effectively ambushed a Major Thomas Van Horn's 200 men who had been sent to support the American supply convoy. And Hull also faced a lack of support from his officers and a general fear among his soldiers of a possible massacre by unfriendly indigenous forces. Remember, there was absolutely no love lost between Native Americans and the US Army of the period. The Native Americans rarely, if ever, took prisoners. If you were captured by a Native American, they would probably fucking scalp you. They would brutally murder you. You would not go quietly. You would not go pleasantly. And this obviously scared the ever-loving fuck, quite rightfully, of US Army soldiers. So, a group of 600 troops led by Lieutenant Colonel James Miller remained in Canada and attempted to maintain some kind of a foothold in the province, and he attempted to supply the American position in the Sandwich area, but was met with little success as he was too few in number. So on the British side, you've got Major General Isaac Brock, who believed that he should take bold measures to calm the settler population in Canada and convince the tribes that Britain was strong. Apes together strong. So he moved to a place called Amherstburg near the western end of Lake Erie with reinforcements, and he attacked Detroit. So despite it being a defensive war, Major General Brock actually immediately launched a counterattack towards William Hull's retreating forces, and he tried to take the town of Detroit using a place called Fort Malden, which is a great name, Fort Malden as his stronghold. Hull, so the US General Hull, feared that the British possessed vastly superior numbers to him, and the fort of Detroit, because the preparations for war were so hasty, Detroit didn't have the adequate amount of gunpowder, cannonballs, food and supplies to withstand a siege by British forces. So rather than actually engage the British in the field of battle, about a week after he marched into Canada demanding that everybody surrendered to him or else face destruction, a week afterwards, unfortunately, General Hull surrendered. He surrendered a week later. And he also ordered the evacuation. He ordered an evacuation of Chicago. It's not going well for the Americans right from the get-go. But unfortunately, as they were evacuating Chicago, another tribe of Native Americans called the Potawatomi Warriors ambushed the retreating American forces and escorted them back to the fort as prisoners of war, where the Native Americans, as you can probably guess, immediately massacred every single last man and civilian in Chicago. And then they burnt the fort to the ground because that's the way Native Americans do shit. Yikes. Anyway, so after this initial setback of surrendering Detroit without a fight, we finally move on to the war in the West, as it would later be called. So essentially what happens is there's a battle in a village called Queenston, which would be known as the Battle of Queenston Heights. The village at the time consisted of a stone barracks and 20 houses, each surrounded by gardens and peach orchards. So it wasn't a proper fort, it literally was just like a civilian kind of fruit and farming village. Several farmhouses were scattered through the neighbouring fields and pastures, and the village lay at the mouth of the gorge of the River Niagara. Immediately south of the village, the ground rose to about 300 feet into Queenston Heights, so it was a very well elevated platform, which meant you could have ranks of infantry all firing at the same time, and the men stood kind of above each other. The slope from the heights to the riverbank was very steep, but overgrown with shrubs and trees, making it fairly easy to climb. Lewiston was on the American side of the river, with the ground to its south rising to as being about 200 yards away from the Lewiston Heights. The river of Lewiston was very fast flowing and 200 yards wide, but it was described as being little trouble to even an indifferent oarsman. So basically, the ground that the British were on was essentially uphill, and in order for the Americans to engage the British forces and attack them, they would have to get across the river on boats. It wasn't a particularly difficult river to traverse, but you did need boats to get across it. You couldn't simply just walk across on foot, which obviously creates some kind of, logistical issues, as you have to get boats of men across at a time. So the British detachment at Queenston consisted of grenadiers. So you had the Grenadier Company of the 49th Regiment of Foot, which was Brock's own regiment. So these men knew and trusted and were trained by Brock himself, which gave him quite a big advantage. And they were commanded under Captain James Dennis, a flank company of the 2nd Regiment of York Militia. So these are Canadian boys, the York Volunteers, or as they would later be known as the Toronto Volunteers, under Captain George Chisholm, a Canadian, and detachment of the 41st Regiment of Foot, with 3-pounder grasshopper cannons. So we didn't have very big heavy artillery, we had very tiny rapid firing artillery that would maybe, if you hit people directly, take a limb off, but we weren't talking about the great big 24-pounders, explosives and howitzers as you would see in the big European battles. Despite how important this war, I guess, is to the Americans, in retrospect, it's actually quite a low-intensity war. So we didn't have very big, big amounts of weapons being used. Let's see. So the 49th under Captain John Williams was posted in huts on top of the heights, with an 18-pound gun and a mortar, which were mounted in a redan halfway up the heights, and a 24-pounder gun and a carronade, which was sited in a barbette at Vrooman's Point, a mile north of the village, which was guarded by a company of the 5th Regiment of Lincoln Militia under a Captain Samuel Hatt. So in all, we've got about 2 companies of Canadian militia, we've got a regiment of Canadians, and we've got 2 regiments of British infantry. There are other Canadian regiments which could have been mobilised, but they weren't on duty at the time and couldn't be assembled at very short notice. So after the British and Canadians are deployed on the heights of Queensland, we start to see the first American landing. So the American forces which were involved in the war were the 6th, 13th and 23rd US Regiments of Infantry, with detachments of US artillery serving as infantry, as there was a critical shortage of infantry. There was also about 4 regiments of New York militia and a volunteer battalion of riflemen. So in all, you had around about 900 regulars and about roughly 3,000 militia. So the British were kind of about outnumbered almost 2-1 during this battle. So the Americans had 12 boats in which to traverse across the lake, each of which could carry about 30 men, and 2 large boats which could carry about 80 men each, which were fitted with platforms in which field guns and wagons could be carried. So these boats were built in a way that they could move artillery and supply wagons across to help support the invasion. Unfortunately for the Americans, right from the get-go, as they were planning their invasion, a last-minute squabble over seniority and precedence led to the command of the first landing party being split. So again, in very, very British traditions, there were arguments between American officers about who goes first and who's commanding what. It's the opening of a major battle with the British, and they're already arguing over glory, which isn't a good sign. Anyway, so there's a Colonel Van Rens. Fucking hell, I have no idea how you spell this name. So there was a Colonel Van Rensselaer who led the militia contingent, and there was a Lieutenant Colonel John Christie of the 13th US Infantry who led the regulars. So the Americans started crossing the river in 13 boats at 4 in the morning. So they did it under the cover of darkness at 4 AM on the 13th of October. Immediately, the boats were being swept downstream by the current of the river, which was severely affecting the speed in which they could get across the river. So 10 minutes after fumbling about trying to get the boats back on track, the landing finally began at the village, in which a British sentry, noticed them, and rather than fire his musket to raise the alarm and thus warn the American troops that they had been spotted, he actually ran directly to the headquarters. And after waiting and observing the enemy landing build up for several minutes, Dennis's troops began firing accurate volleys into the Americans in the midst of their coming ashore. So actually, the sentry had done something very smart. Instead of immediately firing his musket as a lone rifleman towards the encroaching Americans, he'd actually had the sense about him to silently run towards his command staff, inform them that the Americans were invading, and so they set up an ambush whilst the Americans thought they still had the element of surprise. So as the Americans were taking fire from the British artillery and riflemen, Colonel von Ressenlauer was hit in the thigh by a musket ball as soon as he stepped out of his boat on the Canadian shore. And as he tried to form up his troops, he was promptly hit 5 more times in the heel, God bless him. Man was collecting bullets like no one's business. So he's constantly being shot in the heel and in the thighs though. Apparently the British riflemen of the period fucking hated legs. They like shooting people in the heels, the thighs and the calves, and he actually managed to survive despite being shot 7 times. However, because he'd been shot 7 times, he spent most of the battle out of action, very weak from the loss of blood. So Captain John E. Wool of the 13th US Infantry took over and fought to retake the American foothold in Queenston. Whilst that was going on, the British guns opened fire in the direction of the American landing stage at Lewiston, and the American guns, which were 2 18-pounders in an earthwork known as Fort Grey on the heights, 2 6-pounder field guns, and 2 140mm mortars near the landing stage opened fire on Queenston village. Dennis's troops, so the British troops, were driven back into the village, but they kept firing under the shelter of the houses. Hey Backstash, how's it going, buddy? Sorry, I'm late for class. Did I miss a lot? No, not really. I'm going to try to keep these streams to like 2 hours each. I'm going to split this into 2 streams as I kind of experiment how I want to structure these streams. Whether I do go into a lot of detail as to how the battles take place, or just give kind of like a general strategic overview of the situation. I think based on how this has been going so far, I think I'll keep it general and just talk like broadly about how the war's going and what happened, I think, rather than go into autistic detail about the battles. I don't know, I'm not really feeling going into autistic detail about the battles, honestly. It's very hard to follow if you don't have like a video that's showing what's going on at the time, right? And I can't do those fancy Kings and Generals graphics so you see like the units moving in real time. So I think in the next one we'll keep it quite general instead of going into explicit detail. But I'll finish off going into detail with this one. Anyway, so as the battle commenced and hours went by, the light grew as it went from dawn. As dawn became light, the British guns, the British artillery started becoming more accurate. And as the second wave of Americans came, another 6 boats with another 180 men began to cross the river. The crews of the 3 boats, including their 2 largest, which was carrying the commander, Lieutenant Colonel Christie, started to panic as they came under artillery fire. So the boatmen turned the boats back for shore instead of coming to rescue and support the landing party. Despite poor Lieutenant Colonel Christie tried to physically force the boat guys to turn the boats back and invade Canada, they weren't having any of his business. And this later caused controversy when US Captain Lawrence commanded the next boat and asserted that it was actually Lieutenant Colonel Christie himself who had ordered the Americans to run away whilst under fire from British artillery. And that left essentially the Americans with only 4 boats left still in operation, and one of the 4 remaining boats was sunk from British artillery, which was carrying Lieutenant Colonel John Fenwick, who was formerly the commander of Fort Niagara, and 80 men. And this forced them essentially to drift downstream and land in a place known as Hamilton Cove, which was a hollow about 800 yards downriver, where a detachment of Canadians quickly surrounded Fenwick's men and captured them, but not before the Canadians opened fire on the US infantry and grievously wounding Colonel Fenwick and grievously wounding a great many American infantrymen. Apparently Colonel Fernwick took nine fucking musket balls to the stomach and survived that as well. Americans don't want to die. So with all their boats now fucked, all their boats have been destroyed by musket fire and cannonballs, and most of the American forces in the first and second waves were now killed or wounded within minutes of landing in Canada. All the other survivors of Fenwick's party quickly surrendered. The 3 men managed to escape in one boat, which sank on reaching the American side of the river, but they did make it. And the last boat of the American invaders drifted away within easy range of the guns at Vrooman's Point, and the British basically opened fire with all their artillery on the last boat, and the occupants didn't last long, unfortunately. However, despite the clusterfuck and the embarrassing defeat of the American invasion force, something very seriously bad happened to the British as well. So, unfortunately, the commander, Sir Isaac Brock, was himself killed. At Fort George, Brock had been awakened by the noise of the artillery at Queenston, and he considered that this might only be a diversion from the Americans and that the actual American attack would come from somewhere else. So he ordered only a few detachments to move to Queenston, but he galloped there himself on horseback to take command, accompanied only by a couple aides. When he passed through the village as dawn broke, he was being cheered by the men of his own regiment that he formed himself, the 49th Infantry, many of whom knew him well, and he moved up to the redoubt to gain a better view of the American forces. The 18-pounder cannon and howitzer in the Redan were causing great carnage among the American boats since coming ashore, and an hour and a half earlier, the US forces had been pinned down across the river, which was prompted by Lieutenant Gansevoort of the US artillery. These must be Dutchmen with these names. Apparently you had a lot of Dutch officers in the army at the time. Ordered Captain Wall and Ogilvy to take a detachment upstream and ascend the heights by the Point of Rock and storm the artillery battery, which is where Sir Isaac currently was. So this artillery position, the Redan, had very few troops guarding it. There was only several men and Isaac Brock and a couple of his aides. So the light company of the 49th, having been ordered from the heights into the town by Brock to join the fighting, were ordered to do so in order to support the Grenadier Company. They had now essentially left that artillery position undefended. So US Army Captain Wall's troops attacked just as soon as Brock arrived, which forced his small party and the artillerymen to try and flee deeper into the village, after they quickly spiked the guns, taking them out of action. So Brock sent a message to Major General Sheaffe of the British Army at Fort George, ordering him to bring as many troops as possible to Queenston. He was now convinced that Queenston was going to be the main point of the US Army invasion. He then resolved to recapture the Redan immediately, rather than wait for reinforcements. So rather to be reinforced by a brigade, the Giga Chad Isaac Brock thought he'd take a small party of men and just immediately fucking charge the position and take it back from the Americans. So Major General Brock was unfortunately killed in action as he personally led his men up the hill on the right flank towards Queenston Heights. Brock's charge was made by Dennis, the sentry from earlier, and Williams' 2 companies of the 49th and 2 companies of militia. The assault was halted by heavy fire, and he noticed unwounded men dropping to the rear. So the British forces were becoming intimidated, and they were starting to break whilst being under fire from the Americans who had taken the position. In order to encourage his men, Brock angrily shouted that this is the first time I've ever seen the 49th turn their backs. Surely the heroes of Egmont will not tarnish their record. At this rebuke, his soldiers promptly closed up and were joined by 2 more companies of Canadian militia, those of Cameron and Heward, and the British forces rallied themselves to begin the assault to retake the position. The inspirational words from Lieutenant Colonel John McDowell of the Canadians. He encouraged the Canadians to push on he encouraged them to push on. The York Volunteers, the Toronto Volunteers, were to push on whilst he led his own party to the right, presumably intending to join his party with that of Williams' detachment, who were beginning to make progress on that flank. When Brock was beginning the assault on the position, he was struck in the wrist of his sword arm by a musket ball, but he continued the attack despite being injured. His height and energetic gestures, like an Italian, he was making some very fierce hand gestures, together with his officer's uniform with very many flashy medals and a gaudy bright blue sash given to him by the Native Americans after the siege of Detroit, made him a very conspicuous target for the Americans. As the English were obviously coming up the hill and the Americans were looking for targets, what they would see before them would be a lot of dirty men in red overalls, and there'd be this one guy leading the charge who was absolutely decked head to toe in golden embroidery, big shiny medals, and a big bright blue sash, which obviously would scream to American sharpshooters, "This is an officer, kill this guy first." So after seeing General Brock marching up the hill, the Americans all directed their fire towards him and they opened fire at Brock. Unfortunately, Brock was struck in the chest, shot in the heart, killing him almost instantly. His body was then carried from the field and secreted in a nearby house at the corner of Queenston and Partition Street, which would be opposite of that of Laura Secord. So despite being a lawyer by trade with little military experience, Lieutenant Colonel McDowell of the British led a second attempt to take the heights from the Americans, together with Captain Williams of the Canadian Army. With Williams's men and the 49th Infantry, they started moving to the right of the line and they tried to encapsulate the American forces and encircle them with a force of between 70 to 80 men, more than half of whom were Canadians. Despite the disadvantage in numbers as well as attacking a fixed position, Williams and McDowell of the Canadian small force was driving the opposing force to the edge of the gorge in which the redan was submitted, and it seemed on the verge of success before the Americans were able to regroup themselves and stand firm. So the battle's momentum turned when a musket ball hit McDowell's mount, causing it to rear and twist around, and another shot hit him in the small of the back, causing him to fall from his horse. He was removed from the battlefield and unfortunately died of his injuries the next day. So both sides were starting to lose officers at an alarming rate at this point, and morale among the enlisted men was starting to decline. Unfortunately, Sentry Dennis, who'd been a complete lad this entire time, suffered a severe wound to the thigh after being shot by the thigh. People being shot in the thighs again, had an arterial bleed, and he spent the rest of the war unfortunately out of action, not being able to walk again with that leg. So according to legend, Brock's last words as he led their dying was to push on, brave York volunteers. He was ordering his brave Canadian militiamen to continue on the fight and to kick those dastardly Americans from the heights. Where am I? Okay, so what were the Americans doing at this point? So by 10 AM, the Americans were opposed only by the artillery at the Vrooman's Point of the Queenston Heights, which was firing at the American boats at very long range. The Americans were able to push several hundred fresh troops and 6-pounder field guns across the river. They unspiked the 18-pounder in the redan, so they were now using the British's own artillery against them, and they were in a perfect position to fire down into Queenston village, but it had a very limited field of fire away from the river. So with the British starting to fall back in the initial periods, some American soldiers entered the village and started looting and burning the houses. They also managed to rescue Lieutenant Colonel Fenwick and some survivors from his party, but they didn't attempt to drive the Canadians from their stronghold at Vrooman Point. So now, with a lot of the American officers dead or heavily wounded, Lieutenant Colonel Winfield Scott was instructed to take command of the American forces that captured Queenston Heights earlier in the day. And unfortunately, as he began his assault, Winfield Scott himself was captured and was now in British custody yet again, which led to British reinforcements currently arriving at Fort George. So after the battle, after about 4 hours of the battle, a detachment of the Royal Artillery with draught horses and drivers provided by Canadian farmers and militia under Captain William Holcroft with 2 6-pounder guns moved into Queenston village, supported by a company of the 41st Infantry. When they opened fire at 1 PM, it became hazardous for the American boats to continue trying to cross the river. 2 American boats and a scout were sunk, A shrapnel fire several times silenced the American batteries in Lewiston. At the same time, 300 reinforcements came from the Mohawk tribe of Native Americans under Captain John Norton and John Brandt, who climbed up the hill of Queenston Heights and suddenly fell on Scott's outposts. However, despite the numbers, none of the Americans were actually killed, and the Mohawk forces were driven back into the woods. But the American spirits were very badly affected by their fear of the natives. The Native American war cries could be clearly heard in Lewiston, and the militia didn't fancy being slaughtered and scalped if they were to be defeated or captured by the Native American forces. Therefore, they refused yet again to cross the river. So about an hour later, Major General Sheaffe of the British forces arrived at Queenston and assumed command of the British troops as poor Sir Isaac Brock perished. He ordered more reinforcements to join him at Queenston Heights, and when they'd done so, he led his force on a 3-mile detour to the heights, shielding them from the American artillery, where he was joined by another column of reinforcements from Chippewa under Captain Richard Bullock. So all in all, he was now commanding about 800 men, in addition to the remnants of the force which had been engaged under Brock in the morning. So that led to about 800 men on the British side and a little over 900 now on the American side. So the Americans now no longer massively outnumbered the British forces. As Sheaffe's force began to advance, Captain Scott and Wadsworth had a message from General Van Rensselaer from the United States Army. Apparently, the American forces on the heights consisted of 125 regular infantry, 14 artillery, and 296 militia. The Americans decided to start abandoning their positions and their incomplete field works. They began to dig trenches and kind of like the early form of sandbags to fortify their position on the heights. Scott fell back to the top of the heights, where he attempted to throw up a barricade of fence rails and brushwood to cover the evacuation with his regulars, and he placed a 6-pounder gun in front of the line and posted some riflemen on the right among the huts formerly occupied by the light company of the 49th. So General Sheaffe of the British Army took his time forming his men up and preparing them for battle, and he attacked at 4 p.m, so the battle now at this point had been going on for 12 hours. The first attack was made by the light company of the 41st with 35 militiamen and the 300 Native Americans of the Warhawk against the riflemen on Scott's right. After firing a volley, they charged the Americans with the bayonet, forcing the American riflemen to give way in the confusion. Obviously, when you've been shelled at by artillery for 12 hours and you're exhausted and you know very well the way the Native Americans conduct themselves, when you've got 300 Mohawks charging your position with bayonets affixed, you're probably not very well motivated to stand your grounds and get into a melee with them, right? So the American militia, hearing the Mohawk war cries and believing themselves to be doomed, retreated en masse without orders, which caused a mass rout and cursed the men who would not cross the river. General Wadsworth surrendered at the edge of the precipice with 300 Americans. Scott, Totten, and some of the others scrambled down the steep bank in the edge towards the river, but because the British had destroyed all the boats, there was nothing left to evacuate his men with. And because of that, he feared an immediate massacre and decided to immediately surrender to the British before the Native Americans could get their hands on him. So the first 2 officers who tried to surrender were killed by the Native American forces until basically the British had to get them to fucking stop murdering Americans so they could accept the terms of the peace like good civilized gentlemen. So yeah, there was this very, I guess, bizarre sight where American officers under the truce of a right flag approached the British forces wanting to negotiate a surrender, and they were being basically beheaded and scalped by the Native Americans. And so British officers had to physically restrain the Native Americans from killing attempts at American surrender, and they had to run to the river to save the Americans from being massacred by their Native American allies. So once the surrender was made, Scott was shocked to see that 500 militiamen who had been hiding around the heights emerged to surrender also. So basically what had happened is that after the British had accepted the surrender of about 300 Americans, they began like scouting the area to see what else they could find. And they were expecting to catch stragglers of about 20 or 30 extra guys. And they were absolutely shocked when 500 Americans came out of hiding over their force of 300 and didn't try to shoot them, right? That's kind of I guess that would be kind of like an oh shit moment where it's like, oh fuck, we're outnumbered 3-1. Oh wait, never mind the surrendering. Never mind the surrendering, thank God. We were about to give up for a second there. Yeah, that would have been a disaster had the Americans had the morale to keep fighting. So once the surrender was made, Scott was shocked to see the 500 militiamen had been hiding around the heights, emerging to surrender. In all, after the battle was over, after 12 hours, the British suffered 21 killed, 85 wounded, and 22 captured. So for the US, this gives the total American casualties approximately 100 killed. So in terms of kills, 5 Americans died for every British person killed. There were 90 wounded prisoners, and there were 835 other forms of prisoners, including 6 officers, 4 regular officers and 2 militia were among the killed. 11 officers of 6 regulars and 5 militia were wounded, but managed to escape capture from the British. There were 8 officers, 4 regular and 4 militia who were among the wounded prisoners. Those captured included Brigadier General William Wadsworth of the New York Militia, fuck New York, and Lieutenant Colonel Scott and 4 other lieutenant colonels. So all in all, despite this being a relatively, I guess, minor, it's technically a major battle. It's considered a major battle, but there was only a grand total of roughly 1,800 men with both sides who participated in this battle, and the United States lost an awful lot of actually quite senior generals were captured or killed over a battle for essentially what is a farming village and a fruit town, right? So they lost 2 generals and they lost multiple lieutenant colonels. So the aftermath of the battle, what were the repercussions of the battle? So British General Sheaffe immediately proposed a temporary truce and invited US General Van Rensselaer to send surgeons to assist in treating the wounded. And having assented, General Van Rensselaer resigned immediately after the battle and was succeeded as senior officer on the Niagara by Alexander Smythe, an officer whose insolence and refusal to play nice with his fellow US officers earlier had badly injured the invasion attempt. So this Alexander Smythe, this General Smythe, still had his regulars at Buffalo, but he refused to launch an attack until he had an adequate amount of men under his command, which he felt to be around about 3,000. He launched a successful raid to prepare the ground for a full-scale invasion at the Battle of Fisherman's Creek, but then he bungled 2 attempts to cross the river near Fort Erie on the British positions, which drew the loathing of his soldiers as he was an incompetent moron, and he was universally castigated for his refusal to attack. And with rumours of mutiny in the air, Smythe slipped away to his home of Virginia in disgrace rather than remain at his post. So this is kind of something you'll start to see in the early parts of the War of 1812. A lot of very senior American officers are absolutely useless, and they start to gradually either get fired, die, or quietly fuck off back to their homes in disgrace and quiet because they essentially lose all confidence and trust of their junior soldiers, of their soldiers, right? So even though the Americans were defeated, the British had essentially lost their greatest general, Major General Brock. So Brock was a very charismatic and inspirational figure who had on numerous occasions stopped his own troops from mutinying and deserting on the onset of the war. And he was very popular with the civilian authorities in Upper Canada with his blustering confidence and activity. Sheaffe, who was his successor, received a baronetcy for his part in the victory, but unfortunately Sheaffe would never get the same respect and admiration of the soldiers that Colonel Brock did. So he was already known to many of the troops in Upper Canada as a harsh disciplinarian, and although he was a harsh disciplinarian which kept his men in line, he was a very unpopular chap. So if that discipline did break, he couldn't get them to march again. So his success, where Brock had rashly sacrificed himself, could not help him escape censure for not having followed up the victory at Queenston Heights with an attack on Fort Niagara, which had been left basically completely evacuated by its garrison after a bombardment by British batteries that afternoon. The following April, Major General Sheaffe was defeated by a numerically superior American force at the Battle of York, or the Battle of Toronto. Although his decision to retreat with his few regulars was accepted by his superiors, and even his American opponents agreed that his decision to surrender was the military correct thing to do, it left the local Canadian militia, the Assembly of Upper Canada, and the population of Toronto feeling abandoned by the British Army and very aggrieved. So, having essentially lost all trust and faith of the Canadian militia, he was relieved of his appointments in Upper Canada. And Canadians to this day worship the legacy and the legend of General Isaac Brock, and they don't have a very polite opinion of Sheaffe, unfortunately. But what's very interesting about this, we say lieutenant. Why is it called that way? That's a good question. I don't know why it's called that way. I think it's to do with Old English, honestly, Felix. But what was interesting about the Battle of Queenston Heights is that in many respects, you could say that the Americans were actually at one point about to win the battle until the knowledge that Native American forces had arrived in the region. Once those 300 screaming Mohawk natives came, that's when kind of the American offensive went to shit. The Americans didn't want anything to do with the Native Americans, and that caused a mass rout. So yeah, I think the first major battle between the British and the Americans resulted in a decisive British victory, but it resulted in a decisive British victory not because of the British, it was because the Americans were just that terrified of the Native Americans. It was a psyop, right? But yes, that's how that's how the first major battle between the Americans and the British went. Decisive British victory. Unfortunately for the British, these decisive victories over the Americans wouldn't last long, as the terrible American officers would generally feed themselves into the British Canadian meat grinder. We're approaching 2 hours, so I'm going to end it here. I'm going to today was an experiment. I don't think I'm going to go into too much detail, I think, about the battles. I'm going to keep it strategic, and I'm going to keep it generalist to make it easier to follow. But that was good. This was good experience. I'm gonna continue on the stream next week, I think, and I'm gonna change how I structure this, and see how that goes. See if I can make this a bit more engaging. But that was a good experiment, yeah. So we're gonna end things there. We're gonna end things with the first major battle, and what we're gonna do next week is I'm going to start going over some of the major campaigns of the war and what impact they had on the war, both naval and land. And then eventually what we're going to get into is the eventual peace and how that influenced US foreign policy in the future, and how it influenced British foreign policy in the region. So we're going to end it there prematurely as I kind of rejig this around. But thank you very much for tuning in for today's stream, guys. I'm going to end it there. And I'm gonna see what I can do to improve this. But thank you very much. That was a lot of fun. And I think it's Kirsch's birthday stream today, isn't it? It's Kirsch streaming. Let's have a look. I'll see if I can raid the Kirsch. Yeah, she is. I'll raid Kirsch. Yeah, I'm gonna go back and I'm going to I think do something a little bit different with this. But thank you very much for tuning in. Have a good evening, everybody, and thank you for turning up. Sorry, give me 1 second. Feel free to just head on off and do, obviously whatever you want. I'm just gonna, for those of you who want to, I'm just gonna raid the course. I don't really have a raiding message, so don't feel free to not say anything when we raid the course. Just we'll go see course. There we go, and save, and there we go. Yeah, thank you very much for tuning in, everyone. Have a good evening, and I'm still recovering from COVID. I'm really not feeling well, but I felt well enough to do this. I wanted to do today's stream. But anyway, take care, guys. Bye bye.